Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes.
Almost every major human rights violation that has occurred in Latin America in the last 15 or 20 years has one thing in common, that the perpetrators of those crimes all graduated from the School of the Americas.
Welcome back to Curious Naked Diatribes. And before I begin this episode on School of the Americas / Whinsec, I want to talk about my reasons for making this podcast. Some of you may remember from my very first episode, I talk about the Sick Society, and I believe that we are living in a very sick society. And through this podcast, I hope to provide some dots that people may start to connect and see the larger picture, namely U.S. imperialism and the damage and suffering it has caused. Now, I could do every other episode from here on out just on the Israel genocide alone, and that is certainly deserving of our attention. It's absolutely beyond evil. It's disgusting. And it's continuing to this very day. It's been 4 months. I lost track of how many thousands of Palestinians have been killed. And they're targeting hospitals and schools. They bombed a university recently. And this is so unacceptable. The fact that the United States is supporting this, is behind this. It's providing the weapons to kill. Now, what I want to talk about today is the School of the Americas, Whinsec. This is in our hemisphere, our being the Western Hemisphere. And if you live in the United States and pay taxes, then you're helping to pay for a military school in Georgia that trains death squads in Latin America. And the school is called Whinsec, or the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. And it was formerly known as the School of the Americas. And this goes back to 1946. So basically, Cold War, when the United States was paranoid vigilant against any spread of communism in the hemisphere. Basically, the thinking was, this is our hemisphere, and any foreign power better stay out. And so the idea was Latin America, Latin American countries, South America, Central America, they were all going to be capitalist. They were all going to be supporting the United States. We weren't going to allow even democratically elected governments that were communist or socialist or did anything to help its people, to help the poor people of those countries. So you had Panama, this school, this training facility instituted as a way to basically train and indoctrinate Latin American militaries because of these Cold War fears of communist invasion. And since then, the school's moved to Fort Benning, which is now Fort Moore, Georgia. And of course, over the last several decades, its graduates have been involved in some of the worst human rights abuses in Latin America. I mean, we're talking about executions, forced disappearances, torture, rape, targeting students, labor organizers, religious workers, and suppressing social movements. In Guatemala, one of Whinsec's more notable graduates, Efrain Rios Montt, who was among Guatemala's many military dictators, actually stood trial and was convicted of genocide against the indigenous Maya. Eventually, the court decision was overturned. Basically, School of the Americas, or Whinsec, has provided much of the brute force for U.S. imperial interests. And with its help, the United States has orchestrated many coups d'etats in many countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, including Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti. And despite all this, despite the history of documented human rights violations throughout Latin America, the School of the Americas / Whinsec continues to operate today.
Just down the road here is this school, the School of the Americas. It's a combat school. Most of the courses revolve around what they call counterinsurgency warfare. Who are the insurgents? We have to ask that question. They are the poor. They are the people in Latin America who call for reform. They are the landless peasants who are hungry. They are healthcare workers, human rights advocates, labor organizers. They become the insurgents. They are seen as el enemigo, the enemy. And they are those who become the targets of those who learn their lessons at the School of the Americas.
This is Roy Bourgeois. He's the founder of the School of the Americas Watch. It's an organization committed to getting the school shut down. Now, he began his career inside the military, having served in Vietnam as a naval officer. He described Vietnam as a turning point for him, as he and others began to question the violence and the killing. When he returned home, he was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1972, and he then went on to work with the poor in Bolivia. And Bolivia at that time was under the dictatorship of Hugo Banzer, who was a graduate of the School of the Americas. And it was in Bolivia where Bourgeois learned firsthand the bloody mechanisms of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. The U.S.-supported Banzer dictatorship in Bolivia was part of what later became known as Operation Condor. This was an international campaign of basically coordinated state terror, and it targeted students, labor organizers, artists, intellectuals, dissidents, landless peasants, basically anyone who opposed or challenged these U.S.-supported dictatorships in any way could be tortured, killed, or disappeared. Bourgeois writes in the book, From Warriors to Resistors, quote, "The suffering poor of Latin America are doing what we would do if we lived in such dehumanizing poverty day after day. They are saying, basta, enough. They are organizing and calling for a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources. However, when the poor organize and speak out, the men with the guns are there to silence them. The soldiers defend that socioeconomic system, exploiting the poor. It angered me to see my country giving guns and training to the bullies doing the killing. It was all about providing the muscle to protect U.S. economic interests in Latin America, at any cost to the Latin Americans. And that cost has been especially heavy during the 1970s and 1980s. You know, the so-called dirty wars, which personally, I think all wars are dirty. But this was a particularly bloody time in Latin America. But the work of Roy Bourgeois and the activism from SOA Watch appears to have had some success in the 1990s. You know, put pressure on the government to defund the school. According to the SOA Watch website, in 1996, the Pentagon, under intense public pressure, released training manuals used at the school for at least a decade that advocated torture, extortion, and execution.
Some of the language that's actually used in these manuals is just absolutely astounding. Talking about how to subvert the press, talking about how we can break up cliques by torturing and eliminating members of those cliques and the like. I mean, these are very, very disturbing signs that were official United States policy.
Despite this shocking admission, as well as hundreds of documented human rights abuses connected to soldiers trained at the school over its long history, no independent investigation into the training facility has ever taken place. So all this intense scrutiny from SOA Watch and other activists, as well as congressional hearings during the 1990s, eventually pressured the school to change its name to Whinsec in 2001. However, the school basically operates in much the same way as it did before. And much of what we do know about the atrocities carried out by SOA Whinsec graduates comes from the declassified documents and Freedom of Information Act requests, FOIA requests, from activists. But according to a 2020 post on the SOA Watch website, the Department of Defense now refuses to publicly release the names of graduates. I wonder why. But we don't have to accept this. I think it's so important for everyone to be informed about what's going on. What are your tax dollars going to pay for? Are they paying for Latin American death squads? And what about this transparency in government? It's so important that we learn more about it. And if this is the first time you're hearing about this, I encourage you to do your own investigation. Convince yourself that, number one, such a school actually exists and that its graduates are involved in all kinds of human rights violations and crimes against humanity. And number two, very few of those responsible for said violations have ever faced charges or been brought to justice. That many continue to carry out these bloody atrocities with impunity. And they continue to do it with your taxpayer dollars, all in the interest of maintaining U.S. hegemony in the hemisphere. I'm going to link to some resources you can investigate on your own. You can download a copy of the free ebook From Warriors to Resistors to learn more about Roy Bourgeois and other members of the military who began questioning the violence they were a part of. You can find that in the show notes. And I'll also link to the documentary School of Assassins by Robert Richter, with the disclaimer that it does contain some pretty graphic imagery. If you don't like to see dead bodies, you shouldn't watch it. But apart from that, it is very informative and eye-opening documentary. I'm also linking to the SOA Watch website, where you can download a database of past SOA Whinsec graduates. You can download the training manuals, and you can find ways to get involved and take action if it's something you feel strongly about, as I do. Let's demand a better world. Let's shut down Whinsec. Curious Naked Diatribes is a production of Javi Media. New episodes first and third Tuesdays. You can get in touch through info@javimedia.net. Javi Media.